Hobson is president of Ariel Investments, an investment management firm where she is responsible for firm-wide management and strategic planning, overseeing all operations outside of research and portfolio management. Mellody is an advocate for financial literacy and is a regular CBS News contributor on financial issues. Mellody serves on numerous boards, including DreamWorks Animation, SKG, the Estee Lauder Companies, Starbucks, and Groupon. She is very involved civically here in Chicago, serving as chair of After School Matters, a not-for-profit that provides Chicago teens with high-quality, out-of-school time programs. In fact, she and her husband, George Lucas, just generously donated $25 million to the program. She is also on the board of the Chicago Public Education Fund, and Mellody is an active member of the Economic Club, where she is currently serving on the program committee, and we're delighted she's agreed to moderate tonight's presentation. We're honored to have our guest speakers here tonight, two leaders in education who are clearly driving change both inside and outside of the system. Wendy Kopp is the founder and chair of Teach for America, which she started 24 years ago as a student at Princeton. TFA is channeling the movement of leaders into low-income areas so that all of America's children have the opportunity to receive an excellent education. During her travels, Wendy has found that other countries have similar educational concerns for their next generations. As such, she co-founded Teach for All, a global version of Teach for America. Just 6 years into its development, Teach for All is a growing network of 32 independent organizations around the world. Although this is a great success for the organization, Wendy's focus has always been on raising education levels and narrowing educational disparities around the world. Wendy and TFA have strong ties to Chicago, including board members, teacher training programs, and numerous TFA teachers actively helping in the Chicago community. Secretary Arne Duncan has even been quoted as saying, "Wendy and TFA have made teaching cool again." Secretary Duncan is one of Chicago's own and a friend to many here tonight. He was born and raised here and has a long history of service to our community. He served as CEO for the Chicago Public Schools for 7 years before being appointed by President Obama in 2009 to Secretary of Education. Prior to Chicago Public Schools, he ran the Ariel Education Initiative, which is the not-for-profit arm of Ariel Investments that is focused on advancing educational opportunities for economically disadvantaged children. During Duncan's tenure as secretary, he's had many accomplishments that have greatly benefited both students and teachers. He helped to secure congressional support for President Obama's investments in education, including the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act's $100 billion fund to fund 325,000 teaching jobs, increases in Pell Grants, reform efforts such as Race to the Top and investing in innovation, and interventions in low-performing schools. Secretary Duncan has helped secure an additional $10 billion to avoid teacher layoffs, the elimination of student loan subsidies to banks, and a $500 million national competition for early learning programs. And we are proud to note he's also a member of the Economic Club. We're looking forward to this evening's conversation and hearing their thoughts on the challenges and opportunities in today's education system. And ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Secretary Duncan, Wendy Kopp, and Mellody Hobson.
Well, we're very, very excited to have you here. I have to say, in full disclosure, I went to college with Wendy and I worked with Arne. So you can take that all with a grain of salt in terms of how these questions will go. No, I'm just joking. I want to start right off. There is a lot to talk about. People are very, very, very interested in education in this country. A big city like Chicago, we've had a lot of corporate executives involved in education. There have been major efforts around the country that you've seen. Why do you think so many people are so focused on education and yet the outcomes aren't as dramatic as we'd all like to see?
Wendy?
Yeah, we're good friends.
Well, I have to say, so I actually think, let me just take, first of all, the overall outcomes, we, in my view, and maybe this is a shared view up here, we have a serious challenge in our country. I mean, the PISA results just came out showing that, kids in Shanghai are literally 3 years ahead of our kids, 15-year-olds, based on an assessment that tests critical thinking skills. So we've got an across-the-board problem, and we have a much more extreme problem in our urban and rural communities where arguably kids most need a terrific education that enables them, gives them the tools to get out of the cycle of poverty. And yet, we see just the opposite with, here in Chicago, 6% of our low-income kids actually, getting a college degree. So we have a crisis. I think that's a shared view. I will say, I think you're right that this issue has galvanized a tremendous amount of attention, resources, et cetera. I think we're making extraordinary progress, I have to say. And I mean, this is a longer conversation, but I think about just this city and just in the last few years, talking with our folks earlier today, I asked them, how many schools in this city working with low-income kids would you say are actually changing the trajectory of their kids? So they're coming in on average, 6% of them likely to get a college degree. How many schools exist out there that are meaningfully increasing that percentage to between, let's say, 40 and 80%, depending on high school, middle school, et cetera, how long the kids are in the school? And the answer I got back was 45. And I asked them, how many do you think were when these particular people started up here 7 years ago? And they said maybe 5. So that's meaningful change. We can now see in schools that are propagating not only in this city, but all over the country, charter schools, traditional schools, more and more schools within the traditional system as well that are producing life-changing gains for kids. So these schools are showing us what's possible. It's incredibly hard work, but there's nothing magic about it. And now the question is, can we see that kind of progress across whole systems? And even to that question, we just saw the NAEP results come out, and we saw 2 states, Tennessee and Washington, D.C., make more progress in the last 2 years than the average state made in the last 10. So those 2 states are showing us, progress is possible. Their kids are a full half year ahead of where they were 2 years ago, and that's a lot of progress across a whole state of lots and lots of kids. So we're seeing lots of evidence that we can change things. My personal theory about why we're not seeing all of that energy and all the more significant capacity that we see in communities all across the country, why isn't that moving our PISA results? Like, why aren't we seeing much greater progress across states? Honestly, I think it's because we're teaching to the wrong standards. So we've got a lot more energy, a lot more good stuff happening, but we're teaching to low-level standards in most cases. And it's the initiative that the Secretary's leadership and others are working to change through saying we need to embrace much higher standards that promote much more kind of critical thinking, rigorous thought among our kids. And once we do that, once we can marry all the energy that's done so much in the last 20 years and all that we've learned with the standards we should be teaching to, which, by the way, the rest of the world are teaching to, I think we're going to start seeing things really take off.
Okay, there are about 1,000 follow-up questions in there, and we're going to unpack it as we go along. But Arne, I want to speak to something that she said, and you can chime in on the answer to the first question. But she said that 6% of kids in Chicago, a school district you know very well, are making it from beginning to graduating from college. Will you be alive for that number to be at 90%?
I hope so.
What would it take to really move that needle?
So I look not just at Chicago, but I spend more and more of my time looking at these international comparisons because that's where the competition is for jobs of the future. And what I worry about with our nation is, you're right, we spend lots of energy. I'm not convinced we're spending the energy on the right things. And when I look at those countries that are consistently outperforming us, out-educating us, out-innovating us, they do a couple things at scale that we don't. First of all, they basically provide universal access to early childhood education. And as a nation, we're pushing very hard to get that done, but frankly, we're not even close. And the average child coming from inner city Chicago or rural community starts kindergarten a year to a year and a half behind, and we don't do a great job of ever catching them up.
So they're starting at 3 or 2? What age are you saying?
2, 3, 4. but they are across the board providing access there. Secondly, every high-performing country takes their teachers from the top third of graduating classes. Some take only from the top 10%, meaning 90% of people who would like the privilege of teaching don't have that opportunity. Then they pay them and reward them and support them in very different ways than we do here. And then finally, Wendy's point, they all have higher standards. So if I look at what we're doing, those 4 common building blocks of every single high-performing country: early childhood, we are not in the game. Recruiting from the top third of classes, or top 10%, we are not in the game. Paying teachers a much more livable wage, rewarding excellence, rewarding people who take on hard assignments, we're not doing that. And as a nation, we are moving towards higher standards, but having significant pushback from both the far left and from the far right. So for all the effort, those common building blocks, we have yet to commit to as a nation.
What would it take for every kid? What would it take for every child who's born in the United States to go to school at 3 or 4? What would that take for you? Could you make that happen?
So we're asking Congress for $75 billion to go from about 1 million children to 2 million children, to double access.
And how many children would really?
That would basically hit the need. And James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist here in Chicago, talks about a 7-to-1 ROI. So for all the business leaders here, every dollar we invest, we get back $7. Less crime, less teenage pregnancy, less dropouts, more folks entering the world of work. It is the best long-term play that we can make. In the real world, this is totally non-political. In fact, today we have more Republican governors investing in early childhood education than Democratic. It's become a totally bipartisan issue. Just in Washington, we have yet to crack that nut.
So will the $75 billion be easy to get?
No. We are working very, very hard to get some of our Republican friends. We have a handful of Republicans in Congress who are totally on board, and we're working hard to get more of their colleagues to support this initiative.
So why wouldn't they support it?
Because it's a new investment, and new investments, even if they're 7-to-1 ROI, are a hard thing for some of the Republican Party to swallow right now.
And what about the teacher pay? So give me an apples to apples comparison of teacher pay where it's compelling for the top 10% or 30% of a graduating class to take the job.
And it's not just pay, it's status. This is what Wendy and TFA have done, I think, remarkably well.
Well, I was going to say that. She gets the top students.
In other countries, it's doctors, lawyers, engineers, and teachers, all at the same status level, commensurate pay.
So how do you change status?
How do you change status? This is a call to service. This is about if you want to make a difference in this country, if you want to help transform students' lives, there's no better place to do it in the classroom. And supporting that great talent, recognizing it, giving them meaningful career ladders, having them be able to make $100,000 at 30 rather than make $60,000 at age 55. We have to fundamentally do that. And I'm controversial, not everyone agrees with me. I think if you're working in the heart of inner city Chicago, South Side, West Side, if you're working in rural areas, if you're working on a Native American reservation, you should be paid a lot more money.
So is that, some people would take that as combat pay.
I don't like the combat phrase, but it is taking on very difficult assignments. I went to one Native American reservation in New Mexico where half their teachers come from TFA, the other half come from the Philippines because they can't find an American-born teacher to work on that reservation. And these are kids and communities we have devastated for centuries. To think that those children have a chance with that mix of teachers, we're perpetuating poverty, we're perpetuating social failure.
And they won't work there, why?
Because it's very remote, it's in the middle of nowhere, and it's very tough work. But I would argue teaching at Harper High School here, where we had 28 kids shot, is a very different job than teaching at Northside College Prep or teaching at New Trier. We need to start to recognize what it takes to bring our best and brightest to the kids who need the most help.
There are so many follow-up questions. I'm just going to take them as they come. So I want to go to violence. Do your teachers, do they get worried about going to school? We just had the Colorado shooting. How does that factor into your ability to recruit? And how is that factoring into your conversation with them about their job? I mean, that is combat pay, right? In some ways, if you're going to go to school and have to worry about gunmen?
Well, I mean, gosh, where do I start? I mean, I think we have to be smart no matter where you work. And, the schools are board members are working in are in communities that very sadly are plagued by violence. You know, the kids and families we're working with are dealing with that reality every day. And thankfully, for the most part, our schools have been kind of safe havens. And if you develop strong relationships at the school level and in the community, and use good judgment, you know, and, you know, thankfully.
Isn't it more than judgment? I mean, the teacher who walks out of the building to lure away a student, that's bravery. That's not judgment. I mean, it is judgment in some ways because you're protecting a lot more people, but at a great expense to yourself. How do you teach that? And is that part of training, or do you lead that to the local community where a teacher goes to work, that they learn whatever the practices are of the area?
Well, each of our local folks are, we're working with community organizations and others, and we're having conversations with our folks about honestly using good judgment and all. You know, I almost don't want to say this, but we've been doing this for 24 years. We've placed, I guess, 50,000 folks. And, you know, and they've navigated some tough situations, but I think I'm on safe footing saying that by and large, and again, I mean, our folks are in very challenging situations, but by and large, you know, this is not the top thing on their list of challenges. And as you can tell, I mean, we're getting, you know, a flood of folks who, after talking with the people who've joined before and have participated in the program and such, feel like this is what they need to be doing to meet the most pressing needs.
Arne, Warren Buffett says that if you wanted to really solve the issues around public education in the United States, you'd outlaw private schools. And he says it all the time. Do you think there's any merit to that argument?
Whether there's merit or not, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, but it's an interesting...
So I just try and be very practical and pragmatic, so it's an interesting theoretical conversation. And yes, it would level the playing field, and yes, political leaders would send their children to public schools. But given that's not reality, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, frankly, and so let's figure out, given what we're dealing with every day, how we get better.
Is a charter school a public school?
Absolutely. Charter schools are public schools. They are public tax dollars. They're funded by us. They're accountable to us. And I talk about sort of wasted energy. This debate between traditional schools and public schools is absolutely the wrong debate.
Why is it that when they describe them, they say public, charter, private?
Well, they shouldn't. These are public schools. There's one common enemy that we all have, and that's academic failure. And any school that can help to eliminate academic failure is part of the solution. So great charter schools are absolutely fantastic, and we should replicate and learn from them. Great traditional schools are absolutely fantastic. We should replicate them and learn from them. I was at Juarez High School today, a really tough community is doing amazing, amazing work, huge reductions in dropout rates, graduation rates are way up. So no one has a monopoly on good ideas we need to share, but the fight between schools that are actually doing a good job is such the wrong fight. What we all need to fight against are those schools that are dropout factories where 40, 50, 60% of students are dropping out. That's where we're perpetuating poverty and social failure.
But Wendy, you're trying to push for more charter schools in Pennsylvania, correct?
I mean, we're not pushing for more charter schools anywhere. I mean, our teachers are teaching in public schools. They're teaching largely in traditional schools, but more and more of them are teaching in charter schools as the proportion of schools that are charters in urban and rural communities grows.
Is it because they're more accepting of your teachers and methodologies and things like that? Is there a difference between the charter and the public environment for your teachers?
In all honesty, I think, you know, in this hiring environment, given a down economy, you know, the charters are hiring more than some of the traditional systems. But I mean, I'm probably going to get my years slightly off, but if you go back, say, 5 years, I'm guessing 90+% of our folks were teaching in traditional public schools. I think our alums have gone out and helped to pioneer the development of, you know, to take advantage of the flexibility and responsibility that you get as part of the charter system to say, let's actually create a new model of school that actually is set up to meet the extra needs of kids in our communities. And I think, you know, it's much easier to experience success in a school that has longer school hours, that has additional supports and services for kids, that has an incredibly powerful culture of achievement where you're working in partnership with parents and kids and teachers, all in pursuit of a clear mission to set kids up for success in college and in life. And so I think those schools have drawn a lot of our folks, a lot of our alums, and increasingly, especially as we've grown our core and have more folks to go around, we've started placing core members in them as well.
If a core member has a choice, do they care?
We try to meet the preferences of our core, in terms of where the kind of environment, the grade level, the community, where they want to be teaching. So, it's everyone has a unique set of, maybe they want to teach X subject, they want to teach in X neighborhood, et cetera. So they run the gamut, such a diverse group.
So charter schools in some ways are controversial because some people think they're better than public schools. The other type of schooling that gets a lot of discussion and is a center of controversy is for-profit education. So what do you think about that? Is that good or bad for our country?
So you have to look at sort of different levels. Again, for me, go back to where I started, there's one common enemy, and that's academic failure. So anyone who can help to eliminate academic failure, who can increase graduation rates, make sure young people graduate from high school, college, and career ready, we need to learn from those examples. When I was here in Chicago, because the Chicago public schools are so poorly funded, the for-profit sector had no interest. They couldn't make it, couldn't make a profit. I think it's very difficult across the country in public education because generally it's funded so poorly. It's tough to do stuff there. On the higher ed side, there are many for-profit players. Some are doing an amazing job of helping people get back on their feet and find good jobs. Others have been less fantastic. And so again, there's nothing in these labels that makes them inherently good or bad. Are they helping young people be successful? Are they helping people enter the middle class and have upper mobility? Or are they not? And that's the fundamental question we have to continue to ask.
So I'm going to go to one more, where there's a lot of energy around charter schools, for-profit, unions. How do you feel about unions, both of you?
I'll start. Unions in many, Chicago's obviously had a difficult year or two. I more than recognize that. You see unions, like anything else, they're not monolithic. And anyone here who wants to paint them as all good or all bad misses the tremendous diversity and complexity. Just like charter schools run the gamut from horrendous to fantastic in neighborhood schools, so do you have, there are unions across the country. I could take you to New Haven, Hillsborough County. I was in Salt Lake City, Utah last week, where the union is fighting hard for merit pay, demanding merit pay because it's helping to turn around their schools. You have places that are not tolerating failure. You have places like Montgomery County that have had peer review for decades and help support great teachers and help to cancel out those that aren't. So you have unions that are being very, very progressive and working hard. You have others that are more entrenched in sort of old school thinking. This push for higher standards, which is really controversial, both unions have been absolute champions of this. 75% of teachers support it. So again, I think people like to get simplistic answers, and part of what makes education so hard, it is so complex. And so they're wonderful, wonderful union partners. There are others that have further to go, but anyone who thinks that just like sending all the politicians' kids to public schools is not going to happen, anyone who thinks that eliminating the unions is the answer is going to happen, they're actually part of the problem. We need to work with unions, we need to partner, we need to collaborate, and again, we all need to work together to get better outcomes for kids.
What have you learned from the unions?
I meet with them every month, sit down, have breakfast, lunch, work through issues. We agree on some things passionately, we disagree on other things. There's a thoughtfulness there. They are trying to move faster. Again, there's huge variation between the national and the state and the local level. And we've found some amazing, amazing partners who have taken our stuff to scale. We put out money for a teacher incentive fund that only goes to places that are doing differential pay, not tolerating failure, rewarding success. We will only partner with districts where it's union and management working together. We have all kinds of takers. We do a labor management conference every single year. We have a couple hundred districts come in. Now, these are hard sessions, hard work. Sometimes there's some tears shed there. But they're great, great educators who are union leaders. And again, I think they're part of the solution, and we need to listen, continue to learn, to your point, and figure out how we lead the country to where we need to go together. This sort of divide and conquer mentality, I just think, again, perpetuates the noise, perpetuates the status quo that for kids is absolutely unacceptable.
Just to to jump in here, I mean, and just really second much of what Arne just said. In the end, I think what we've seen across the country, not only as it relates to unions, but I mean, name anything, school boards. Aren't school boards the problem? What about, is it, any given group? You realize leadership is everything. And that's the answer. Like, we can bring this entire issue within our control if we can get to the point where we have a critical mass of leadership working at every level of our school system, at every level of policy, in our school board seats, in our unions, and in our communities, who are united by a few convictions. One, we need transformational change for our kids, the kind of change that will ensure that we don't just see a few percentage point gains on standardized tests, but we see meaningful change in the options that are available for our kids at the end of the day. People who are shared in their understanding that is possible. We know this is possible because any of us right now can go into dozens of schools in this community that are showing exactly what it takes. Once you know change is possible and have a grounded understanding in what it takes, we can reshape our policy environment, we can build the capacity we need within the system, we can take some of the pressure off of schools through thoughtful, community-based interventions. So to me, this is, and of course this is the core idea of Teach for America and of all the Teach for All organizations around the world, is to say we need to cultivate a generation of leaders who are committed to this and who have a very grounded understanding, the kind of understanding that comes from having taught successfully in low-income communities, and who will therefore lead our unions, as we would hope, in a way that puts kids first and values teachers and the profession and builds the teaching profession as well.
Just one quick follow-up, just a concrete example. One story I think the media is totally underreported that we've done is we've put out a couple billion, Race to the Top gets all the press, which is fine, and we can talk about that. We've put out more money to turn around low-performing schools. We put out $5 billion behind the bottom 5% of schools, those schools that by any measure were not serving children well. And for our schools to receive our dollars, we've asked for some really hard things. In many places, a change in principalship, because leadership matters so much, as Wendy said. In many places, it's moving staff out. And because there's not been a lot of outcry and not a lot of controversy, the media runs to where the noise is. This has been massively underreported. And we've seen huge turnarounds in many schools, including Juarez right here in Chicago, we saw earlier today. But just one example, Prince George's County in Maryland went in, moved out the principal, moved out about 60% of the staff, and they did it in partnership with the union. And I asked the union leader, why did you do this? He said, Arne, it's the hardest thing I've done in my career, but the kids here deserve something better. We had to do it. And it's that kind of profile and courage which never gets covered, which never gets recognized, which never gets rewarded, and that's happening all over the country. But again, somehow, because it's not sexy and newsworthy, noisy, the media is much less interested there.
So they are interested in school closings. So how do you feel about school closings as a way of improving schools?
School closing, I always say, is an absolute last resort. And no educator wakes up in the morning saying, I want to go close some schools. That's not something anyone has to do. You close schools for a couple reasons. You close schools due to declining enrollment. And to have schools of 100, 150 kids that have a capacity of 700 or 800 doesn't make sense. You also close schools for academic failure, where it's simply not working for children. And you have to be very, very thoughtful. You have to partner with the community. You have to have great, great communication. And for all the challenges here in Chicago, I'm always looking for what are the counterexamples. And let me just give you one counterexample that I think for this audience might be important to understand. Denver, Colorado, many urban districts are declining enrollment, having to close schools, Philly, DC here. Denver is actually opening schools they closed 5, 6, 7 years ago because so many more students are coming back to the public schools. And they're coming back because there's increasing public confidence in public education. And enrollment is up 10, 11%. And their union and management together are doing very, very different things and rewarding teachers very differently based upon not seniority, but at student achievement. And they have a mixed delivery of traditional schools and charter schools and others. But because of what they are doing, people are coming into Denver and coming to the public schools. And so all these issues that other cities are fighting are basically avoided. And so there's always a different way to do that. There's not a finite of children who want to go to Chicago public schools or any other public school system. The question is, how do you increase public confidence? And when folks are at each other, when relationships are dysfunctional, that doesn't create public confidence. When folks work together and do really hard things, Denver is one example where that's led to a huge increase in the number of schools, number of teachers working. Union management don't agree on everything, but I think there's some pretty significant lessons there that Chicago and other cities could benefit from paying attention to.
Didn't Colorado just deal Denver a blow on a tax incentive that they were trying to pass, that they had this widespread support for, and Mike Johnson
They didn't have widespread support, so I would have loved it.
They had Denver support.
They had Denver support. The state didn't support it. The state has been, doesn't love taxes, which many states don't, and it was a pretty significant boost in revenue, and it didn't pass.
Do you think that was a bad thing?
I think education is the best thing that we can invest in at every level, early childhood, K-12, higher ed. And we can't invest in the status quo. We have to invest in a vision of reform. We've gotten far too little improvement in progress for the money we're investing. But if we invest strategically and challenge ourselves on the ROI, for us to shortchange the millions of kids we're shortchanging today, for me, it's just a heartbreaking loss of social potential, and the lack of upward mobility, the lack of the path to the middle class, that only goes through the classroom. And I worry tremendously about the haves and the have-nots in our nation. And I think the only way you can get through that divide is through high-quality public education for all.
I'm going to come back to the haves versus have-not, but first, Wendy, you said something that I don't want to lose. You talked about transformational change, that everyone agrees on that. Everyone can point to schools around the country, around the world, that are remarkable. But even with you having 32,000 alumni, there's been no transformational change that has gone to scale.
Well, we're seeing lots of evidence that it's possible. I mean, look at New Orleans, We had...
But it's a smaller school system versus...
It's worth considering this example, because I'm telling you, if 7 years ago people had predicted that we would see the kind of progress we've seen in New Orleans, none of us would have believed it. Now we can all explain it away. But this is a system of 35,000 kids, all African American. I'm sure that's pretty accurate. 21% of African American kids were meeting state standards 7 years ago. 60% of African American kids are meeting higher state standards now.
But they had to shut it down to start it over. I mean, in some ways, they had a flood. The city, was shut down.
That's what we're seeing in New Orleans, but there are so many other examples. I mean, I think it would not be, I think back, 20 years ago when I got started in this, we were talking so little about this issue because there wasn't a huge sense of possibility. In fact, there was a school here in Chicago, all eyes were on that school, the Marva Collins School, which was taking a group of Chicago kids and putting them into selective colleges, and people wrote it off to her charisma. Today, we have dozens of those schools, growing numbers of them, hundreds of them, so we now know it's possible, and now the conversation, as recently as, over the last decade, has shifted to, okay, how do we do this at the level of whole school systems? To look at a state that has historically been something like number 48, the state of Tennessee, and see that it could, literally the people in Tennessee are amazed at this progress. It's like, wow, our kids are a full half a year ahead. Our state ranking is increasing. And what did they do? They didn't do what New Orleans did. They didn't shut down all the schools in Tennessee. They did a couple things. They embraced the Common Core rigorous standards. I believe they were the first state to live into those, and they invested a whole lot in developing teachers. I had the privilege recently of spending some time in Shanghai with the leaders of these 32 organizations in the Teach for All network, really diving in and trying to learn from what has been a true transformation there. A couple decades ago, there were, this was not a very prosperous city, and the educational outcomes were very low, and there were significant gaps between the migrant kids and the other kids, and here they are now, according to the PISA, with the highest levels of excellence and equity in the world. And what was so fascinating to see is, yes, they've got a culture that, and by the way, we should talk about culture, like how do we get to the place in our country where, once again, we believe that we've got to prioritize education in our own lives. Our kids believe that this is the ticket. Our families believe that, you know. So they have that context in Shanghai, but to listen to the man who's kind of driven much of the change over the last 2 decades talk about what really, in his view, is responsible was just fascinating, because it's all the stuff that we know accounts for success in the highest performing schools and in the states that are making the most progress. Number 1, embrace rigorous standards that promote critical thinking. Number 2, invest in teacher development at the school level. I'm pausing because I have come to believe this is it. As he said, we will not have a teaching profession of fully extraordinary human beings who come in at the top of the top of the top. We're going to take ordinary people and turn them into extraordinary teachers. They free up 30% of teachers' time, and like every one of the highest performing schools I know of, they build an incredible culture that's all centered around teacher development. Individual coaching, collaborative teams at grade levels and subject areas working together on lesson planning. And they have an incredible commitment to equity. This man's leadership around inspiring that country, or that city, excuse me, to believe and know that this isn't a zero-sum game. Rising tides lift all boats. We have got to make sure that our most disadvantaged kids attain an excellent education. And if we can do that, then in fact, the education levels of our most advantaged kids will only increase. And the concrete policies that they've undertaken to achieve equity have been significant. So if Shanghai can do it, honestly, if we decided to, we could do it too. And I think the DCs and the Tennessees and the New Orleanses and honestly many others are proving that that's possible.
The Tennessee example is a fascinating one, and I'm absolutely interested in growth and gain rather than absolutely where you are. I just want to know, are you improving each year? And again, what Tennessee and DC did is they just knocked the ball out of the park and no one was close. Just want to tell you a little story. The governor of Tennessee, who's a Republican governor, Governor Haslam, when he first took office, came to see me. And I had a conversation, I talk to politicians every day, I had a conversation with him I've never had with anyone else. He said, Arne, every politician says they're for education, and no one ever does anything. And what can I do differently? And we had this very hard conversation about where Tennessee was and where they could go. And I challenged him, could they become the fastest improving state? Because they're like 48, they're not going to be top. And in just a couple years, he's done it. And so it's just a remarkable profile.
So what did he do differently?
So he did a couple things. First of all, he acted not like a politician. He did really, really hard things. So he raised standards. And it's just, my numbers won't be exact, but when he raised standards, they were telling kids in the state of Tennessee, 4th grade math, they were saying that 91% were proficient. And when they raised standards, they went from 91% to 29%. And achievement gaps that were already horrendously large doubled. Think about the pressure a politician gets who has to tell all those children and families, you thought you were performing here, but you're actually here, and those gaps that were already horrendous are much worse. But guess what? For the first time ever in Tennessee, those kids and families were told the truth. And what they did is they created a new baseline. He dealt with the political fallback and the controversy and the pressure. They all worked together, teachers, communicating to parents, families, and from that new honest baseline, they had the biggest growth, the biggest gain the next year that the state had ever seen. They've worked very hard on teacher and principal talent. They've been relentless about identifying great talent, moving out low performers, recognizing excellence. It's just really, really hard stuff for Republicans and Democrats to do, but they've stayed the course. It's actually been interesting. A Republican governor, a Democratic state superintendent, they've taken huge heat, but now they're leading the nation where we need to go. We just don't have enough political leaders who have that kind of courage, who put politics aside. He has walked the walk in ways that folks don't do. Every politician is for education. No politician runs against education, but they don't do anything. They don't do anything. This guy and a handful of others are actually walking the walk.
So he sounds like he did a lot that was similar to what happened with the Common Core, right?
Part was raising standards.
So can you explain the Common Core and what the outcome of that has been? And Wendy, I want you to talk about it as it relates directly to your own 3 children.
So what's been interesting is, for our nation, 50 different states, 15,000 school districts, much more decentralized than most of the high-performing countries, and theoretically that decentralization can lead to innovation and creativity that will go ground up. Again, what happened under No Child Left Behind, and No Child Left Behind is a million problems I won't go into, it's absolutely broken law, but one of the worst things that happened in order to try and hit a high bar, many states actually dummied down their standards. And again, to make politicians look good. And it's one of the most insidious things that have happened because you were telling children and families they were ready when they weren't. And this is where I need the business community to step up. The business community was absolutely silent. So politicians on both sides of the aisle got a pass for doing this. And so standards got dummied down, kids were lied to, and expectations got reduced. What we were able to do was, is to challenge states, and states have done this absolutely voluntarily, is to work together to raise standards, internationally benchmarked.
And the Race to the Top helped with that.
Create some incentives for higher standards. What No Child Left Behind did, it was very loose on goals, 50 different goalposts, many got dummied down, but very tight, very prescriptive on how to get there. Just from a theory of change, from a change management standpoint, I just think that's fundamentally backwards. So what we're trying to encourage is high standards for everybody, college and career ready, but be very flexible. Give lots of room for folks to be creative at the local level. To think that we can dictate that from Washington would be the height of arrogance. So states have stepped up. Again, governors across the aisle, from Deval Patrick in Massachusetts to Jeb Bush to Mike Huckabee to Mitch Daniels, stepped up and said our children should be held to high standards. They've worked together to do that. There's significant pushback from the far right and from the far left, but 46 states have adopted higher standards and 46 states are moving forward. The final thing I'll say is adopting higher standards was a monumental step in the right direction, but that's just the first step.
So do you have to get worse to get better? So is getting worse like a wake-up call for the state or the parents?
It's not getting worse, it's being honest.
Okay, so but you see the scores one day at one level and then the next day at another, so
Yeah.
it looks like they dropped when in fact you're just measuring the right things.
It's a new honest baseline, and I think the only way any of us get better in life is we tell each other the truth. And when we lie to children, we lie to families and tell them that they're successful, we do them a huge disservice.
So do you think that the truth was a wake-up call?
The truth is absolutely a wake-up call. One of the reasons I do what I do is I took a year out from college to work with my mom's tutoring program here, was asked to tutor a young man who wanted to play college basketball who was on the B honor roll at King High School. And I was happy to try and help him. We started working. He was functionally illiterate. He could barely read. And this is a young man who had stayed out of the gang, stayed away from the violence, had played by all the rules, was a junior in high school, and he'd been lied to his entire life. And it was just absolutely crushing to me that he is set up for failure. That's what we've done to millions and millions of kids and families across the country. Whenever we raise the bar, whenever we ask more, kids always meet us there, always meet us there.
So why do the far right and the far left oppose this when, quite frankly, they never agree on anything, but they agree on opposing this?
You probably better ask those two extremes and what they think, but my short analysis, I think the far right worries about a lack of local control, and again, we're trying to absolutely maintain local control. We just say we want kids to get over the same high bar, and this has been created by teachers at the local level. And on the far left, what we're challenging is the status quo around accountability. And we want to know what teachers, what principals, what schools, what districts, what states are actually showing improvement. And it's tying a piece of teacher evaluation and principal evaluation to student learning. And that's sadly a radical concept in America. But I think teachers teach not because they want to teach, but because they want their children to learn. And having some sense of whether children are actually learning, I think is really important.
So Wendy, New York was one of the first states to adopt the second state, maybe,
Yep.
to adopt the Common Core. And your children are in New York public schools, and
Yeah.
they had to confront this new
I wrote an op-ed
baseline.
on this. I mean, honestly, as a parent, I think this is an absolute gift. And, you know, there was a lot of concern about how this was going to go down because, you know, all these kids and schools that thought they were doing okay, suddenly, I mean, you know, I think we went from an average proficiency level of around 70% to 30% based on the Common Core. I have to say, and I'll just tell one story. So I have a really just kind of incorrigible kid who sees nothing but positivism in his life and has gotten nothing but positive feedback all the way through school. I mean, he is a lovable kid. His teachers love him, and you look at his report cards and think, everything's perfect. Now, you know, I look at his work and I'm like, we've got some serious issues here, particularly on the writing side of things. So I, you know, been trying to give this feedback for years. He's written me off as the most negative mom he knows. None of his friends have negative mothers like this. So we open, and I am not exaggerating, this is exactly what happened. So we open the Common Core results, and he looks at this, and literally the first thing out of his mouth is, "You were right." Think about that for a minute. I mean, in all seriousness, we are kidding our kids, right? Like, he saw, wow, his math scores were great, which is, sort of, there was lots of evidence, and, you could see that. And his writing scores were terrible. So despite getting nothing but perfect scores on every report card, it was clear that when you put this up against a rigorous standard, he wasn't making the cut.
Didn't that make you worry about your kid's school, though?
Well, we should all be worried, right?
But
I've always been concerned.
So, do you see this score and you say this isn't right, and you tell the teacher, how are you giving him this grade?
Well, sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, it informed my parent-teacher conferences, absolutely. And now I have better evidence on my side to back up the fact that we got to do more work. To me, this is a gift because, and that's exactly what happened. Like, this year, I'm like intervening with those 6th grade teachers saying, really, you haven't noticed that we've got an issue here? Let's get on it. And I've got him like in various things to try, and thank heaven I have the resources to do this. And even more so for the families that don't have the resources, where honestly getting a great education is much higher stakes. So I don't comprehend this argument at all. We should view these set of standards as an absolute gift.
So some people say the criticism has been that the one thing that doesn't come through is creativity in this Common Core, so that it is leading to a type of student that isn't being encouraged to be creative because it's not being assessed. And some would say that in China, that is not a part of the core curriculum, some of the things that have made America very specific around creative arts, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you respond to that?
I think there are lots of misunderstandings here. I mean, it's not that any set of standards is absolutely perfect, but this one, from my perspective, is a massive step forward. I mean, the core principle of these standards is, instead of trying to cover a lot of stuff at a surface level, which leads to lots of rote learning, let's cover fewer standards much more deeply. It's a lot more critical thinking based. It's a lot about rigor. It's a lot about reading and writing and depth. Having just been in Shanghai, I have to say, this man who's driven against so much of this attributes, first of all, he says the #1 driver of Shanghai's transformation was their, quote, open door policy. They sent their educators around the world to learn from others, and it drove a pedagogical revolution there.
Sounds expensive.
They spend a lot less than us, I'm pretty sure, right? Meanwhile, what does the US do when we see these rankings? We say, well, we've got Silicon Valley. That's literally, how many times have I heard that in the last 2 weeks since those PISA rankings came out? It's like, can we have both? Can we actually have critical thinking skills in our kids and Silicon Valley? We are wasting so much potential in this country. And honestly, instead of just writing off China or Shanghai, we should say, actually, how many educators can we get to go over and see what they're doing?
I think in a Mellody, rich, poor, white, black, Latino, doesn't matter. Every parent wants more for their kids rather than less. And when you have an honest conversation with parents about this, they figure it out. I think it's incumbent upon us to better communicate to parents, to better partner with teachers. And again, to be clear, raising standards is a great first step. Teaching to those higher standards is really, really hard work. Working
Completely.
with parents, working with 5th and 6th and 7th graders. And so we're onto something very, very special. But if we don't, like anything else, any great idea, it's not the idea, it's the execution, it's the implementation. So these next couple years, we're going to lead the country to an entirely different place that will be sustained for the next couple of decades, or we'll have a massive setback. So the stakes here are very, very, very high.
I once heard you say, Arne, that when you have traveled around the world, I think you went to somewhere in Asia, I can't remember the country, it may have been China, and you said the one thing that you were struck by when speaking to the political leaders was that the parental involvement was so high that it was almost problematic.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what country it was.
Yeah, it's actually, I've traveled less than Wendy, but the anecdote is actually from the president. And South Korea is one of these countries that out-competes us on every measure. Test scores, top, college graduation rates, top. And the president always asked about education. So he asked the president of South Korea, what's your biggest educational challenge? And the president of South Korea right away said, my parents are too demanding. And even my poorest parents demand a world-class education. And I have to spend millions of dollars each year to import teachers to teach my children English in first grade because my parents won't wait until second grade. And here in this nation, if we had more parents demanding a world-class education, this thing would fix itself regardless of politics and ideology.
So why doesn't that happen? Why do parents protest a bad school being closed? And why don't parents hear 6% chance of graduating from college and say, I'm going to the streets to riot on this?
They do hear it, but I think we generally do a very poor job of talking to parents and communicating. And it's hard to want something that you don't know, that you've never seen. And we used to close, we didn't close schools by, at the level that they've done recently here, but we would close some schools when I was here, would have massive parents, upset. And then next year, many of those parents who are most upset would come back and thank the board for what they did for their children. And your enemy is not the parents who are fussing. Those are the parents who actually care desperately about their children. And let me be very clear. These parents in these communities have been lied to about so many things for so long to think that they shouldn't be skeptical or shouldn't be cynical. You have no appreciation of their reality if you don't understand that. And all we tried to do was to tell the truth and stay with it. And if you simply tell the truth and produce a better education for their children, they will be your biggest fans. The challenge is not them. The challenge is the parents where mom is on crack and dad is locked up and that kid doesn't have anyone at home. Those are kids that we all need to find better ways to reach out to.
What is it? Yes, go ahead.
Well, what's so encouraging is to see more and more really thoughtful efforts to reach out and engage parents. I'm visiting a program tomorrow outside of Denver in Aurora, Colorado, that one of our alums who's from Aurora started to engage. I mean, she's literally building a parent movement. And it starts with educating the parents about, here's what's going on in our schools. I mean, honestly, the parents on the Upper West Side of Manhattan have no idea the Common Core was a wake up for parents, and it is all over the place. Like, we need to help our parents understand the kind of education our kids are getting, what they're being prepared for, what they need to be demanding, and what they can do to affect change. And I think as we engage deeply in that kind of work, we're going to see the support for these changes grow.
But isn't TFA doing some work in parental advocacy?
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, through our teachers and alumni.
But you're getting behind this and a part of that kind of effort,
hugely.
Right?
Well, because we've seen, to the point that we can bring everything within our control, and we've learned a lot about what everything is. And so in every community, we can ask ourselves, what are our assets? Where are the weak links? And in most communities right now, we're not doing enough to engage parents, to engage communities, to organize our communities so that they're the ones demanding change. And so in partnership with many others, just because we're a talent provider, we can, fuel the force of folks who are out there working alongside others to do that kind of work. I sort of want to say, I want to go back just briefly to the Tennessee and New Orleans and DC examples and say one word, and I know this is a little parochial, but for 24 years, I've fought this battle to try to get people to understand what Teach for America is doing. Because, and it's only going to take 1 minute, but most people think that Teach for America is about getting a bunch of folks to commit 2 years to teach. And most people think that those folks then go off and they go to law and business, et cetera. What really happens is that these folks, that experience, which has a very positive impact for their kids based on a lot of rigorous research, but it's also deeply transformational for those folks. And very few people ever leave. 2/3 of them stay full-time, so 36,000 alums, 2/3 of them full-time in education, and of those, the other third, half of them have jobs that relate in some way to schools or low-income communities. What's fascinating is take all the TFA alums out of Tennessee, DC, New Orleans and any number of other communities, including this one in Chicago, and you would take away a lot of the energy and leadership that's driven the change. The state commissioner in Tennessee, who's surrounded himself by a whole lot of others, is TFA alum. In DC, not only 8 years of the school's chancellors, but most of the senior team, 20% of the school principals, hundreds and hundreds of the teachers in the system, all TFA alums. And in New Orleans, 40% of the school principals are TFA alums, and the state commissioner of Louisiana is as well, et cetera, et cetera. So this is about cultivating the talent and leadership we need alongside a whole lot of other talent and leadership, right? But this is one stream, and it's so incredible to think about the fact that the biggest employer in this country of top grads is our urban and rural school districts, who are getting about 6,000 of them a year. And the last thing I'll say is, because I don't want people to leave hopeless, like, gosh, but we've been going at this for so long. We've got 36,000 alums, and we're not number one on the PISA. We're bringing in more people each year now than we brought in the first 12 years of TFA. So we are going to see all of these investments, not only in Teach for America, obviously, but in so much else, so many of the other efforts that we've all talked about here tonight pay off. In particular, I think, it's hard to, improve our outcomes if we're teaching to the wrong standards. So if we can actually embrace the rigorous standards and complement it with all this great talent, energy, and such, we're gonna see the needle move in a big way.
So 24 years. We're down to our last few minutes. 24 years. What do you know now that one thing that if you wish you had known 24 years ago, that maybe would have gotten you here faster, or had you done something differently? Because there have been critics. Do you feel that any of the critics of your work have anything that they've said that has been justified where you said, what, there's something to that?
Teach for America, we've learned so much. I can't even fathom coming up with one thing to say right now. It's almost everything I can't describe how much we've learned over time. I'm not sure we've learned as much. There are thoughtful critics, and then there are other critics, and we've learned a tremendous amount from our work on the ground in schools in partnership with, incredible school principals, district partners, other organizations in our communities. The closer you get to the issues we're addressing in urban and rural communities, the more people know that we've got to do something about the status quo. And we've been on an incredible journey. I wish I'd known, although who knows if I knew what I know now, but one thing we've learned is how much has to go into teaching successfully. Not only the personal characteristics people need to bring to this business, because it's incredibly tough work, but the volume of skills, knowledge, and mindsets that it takes to be truly successful with kids. We're still on that journey. How do we prepare and support our teachers to make even in their first and second years a meaningful difference in the trajectory of their kids? That's one thing I'll say, but there's a whole lot else.
Did you ever consider, in some ways you innovated, and in some ways you have been a disruptor, right? Did you ever consider working in the system? If the next president came to you and said, you really should be the Secretary of Education, would you consider it?
I personally probably wouldn't, but only because, first of all, we have people like Arne who are cut out for these jobs.
So Arne would stay and do a couple more
when I think
terms?
about what my core thing is, I really believe my personal impact will be much greater growing the force of thousands and thousands of people, not only here in this country, but all around the world, who ultimately form a global movement to say we're going to see rising educational levels and decreasing educational disparities. I think that's the biggest impact I can have, but I thank heavens every day for Arne, honestly, and others like him who will help build the public support that we need, because we need people working from inside and outside the system.
So Arne, are you going to live in Chicago again one day?
I hope to. This is home. I'm thrilled to be back. Hope to come home.
And Arne, if you could isolate what you know from your vantage point as a Secretary of Education, and overlay that to your time as the superintendent of the Chicago Public Schools, what would you have done differently?
There's so many things that you want to do differently. The question for me is, how do you accelerate the pace of change? How do you get better faster? And some of the things that I think the district is working so hard to do now, more early childhood education is hugely important. Having meaningful teacher evaluation was a major, major breakthrough. More time is critically important. So I think some of those innovations that Ram and the team have done now are absolutely moving the district in the right direction.
Okay, last question. For both of you, same question. You have an unlimited budget, unlimited, to spend on one thing that will completely move the needle in education. What is it?
Oh gosh. I'm going to stick with my theme of the night, although with a slight shift, because I couldn't agree more that, I mean, embracing higher standards is like step one out of, I don't know, thousands of steps. Like, I would invest in teacher development. And not only around the Common Core, but I mean, I really have become convinced based on all of our work and all of our work with schools of education and such, that I think the key to, you know, better teachers and a stronger teaching force is school-based professional development. I think we need to reshape our schools so that we embed within our schools the kind of daily, ongoing feedback and opportunities for collaboration and teamwork and such. Like, that is what we see happening in the strongest schools. It's what we see happening in Shanghai. It's what we see happening in Tennessee. Like, this is what we need to do, and we're not investing nearly enough in genuine, authentic, meaningful teacher professional development at the school level.
I would invest massively in early childhood education, that we have to level the playing field. We have to have our babies enter kindergarten ready to be successful. But I just want to say quickly, the answer is not just more money in education, and ultimately what we need is politicians. I'm totally non-political, across the political spectrum, left, right, Republican, Democrat. We need political leaders, local, state, federal, held accountable for what are they doing around education. And every politician talks about it, the vast majority get a pass. If many more folks voted and put their money behind people who are either moving the needle or not, this thing would correct itself regardless who is in power. We don't have that kind of collective political push from the business community, from parents yet. And until we do that, our progress will be slower than it should be.
Arne Duncan, you have the final word. Arne Duncan, Wendy Kopp. I have to say, I personally am so grateful that both of them do what they do, because they really have made our country and the world a better place. Thank you.